Hello everyone. My name is Nerily Duffy and I'm the Head of Digital Communications and Marketing here at Carlow College. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture in the Leaving Cert lecture series and are exploring the 1913 lockout. Speaking today is Carlow College lecturer in history, Dr. Elaine Callinan. Elaine's research interests lie in examining how politicians and political parties campaigned in elections in Ireland just before the foundation of the Free State. And she's particularly interested in how election campaigns were conducted in an era of political and military upheaval in Ireland and in the legacy of the same on the Free State and Northern Ireland. For today's lecture, if you have any questions during the lecture, just post them into the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I'll put these questions to Elaine at the end of the lecture and for discussion. We'll also be publishing the full lecture on YouTube, and we'll send the link along with the lecture slides to all attendees when we have it available. So now I'd like to hand over to Elaine for today's lecture.
Thank you very much, Nerily, and hello everyone, and you're very welcome today to our talk on the lockout in Dublin in 1913. This was a very interesting time, and it's interesting insofar as how it influenced really the lower socioeconomic class in Dublin at the time, and it paints a portrayal of our city in a very grim kind of manner. But nonetheless, we still have to study these things, and it is an interesting period of labour history in Ireland that we really should look at. But in order to understand the lockout, we really have to go back and understand what life was like in Dublin during these times. And, we're talking about Dublin today, but this situation was similar across all cities like Cork and Galway and Dublin and Limerick. So we can apply the same things, but the lockout itself really only happened in Dublin. So what were the working conditions of people like during this time? Well, you had two different types of workers. You had skilled workers and unskilled workers. And the skilled workers received higher pay. They had more secure employment. And they also had the protection of craft organisations and trade unions, now largely British-based trade unions at this time. The unskilled labour, well, unfortunately for them, they were paid much lower wages. There was a greater oversupply of workers. It was often short-time work and casual work, and the payment methods were rather strange the way we'd understand them today, because a lot of the casual workers were paid in pubs, but I'll explain that as we go along. The census of 1911 recorded 90,000 adult males in Dublin City. Now, this naturally growing population was also swelled by people moving into the city from the country, looking for work and looking for jobs. So there was always far more workers than there were jobs. Unemployment was high, and sometimes even as high as 20%. So you can imagine that with such competition for jobs, unskilled workers were in a really weak position to demand better pay and conditions. And that largely speaks to the male workers, but there was also women workers and children workers during this time too. Now, children not so much because of the Factory Acts and stuff that had come into play, but still a lot of women workers. Across the likes of the Jacobs Biscuit Factory, the Ulster Linen Mills, there was about 3,000 women working. And the payment and conditions for women was not great at all. They were paid half of men's wages, first off. Most men in Dublin had to work a 70-hour week for only 14 shillings a week, which is about a modern day £40. Women had to work an average of 90 hours per week for around 6 or 7 shillings, which is roughly about £20 today. Now, women also worked as domestic help in some of the city houses of the wealthy during this time as well. But the living conditions for people was also very grim, particularly for the poorer classes. Most of the lower socioeconomic group lived in one-room tenements. Now, a tenement is kind of hard to describe, but if you imagine yourself in Dublin City or any city and you look around and you see these lovely Georgian houses, those Georgian houses were once lived in by one family. Imagine like a mom, dad, and 2 or 3 children. But when the Parliament closed down in Dublin after the introduction of the Acts of Union in 1801, a lot of those families left the city, and those buildings were purchased by what we'd call slum landlords. And instead of having one family per building, you often had 10 families in the same building, and each family living in one room. So if you look at the figures during this time, as late as 1914, over 20,000 families. So that was 1/3 of the city's population were living in these tenement conditions. Housing for unskilled workers was really bad. And these are the families that largely lived in desperate poverty. And even if you look at the death rate in Dublin City during these times, it was as bad as Calcutta in India. And the city's slums were amongst the worst actually in the world. So as I said, over 20,000 families lived in one-room dwellings. Now, James Connolly, who we'll meet in a few minutes, spoke about these times, and he stated, "Ireland is a country of wonderful charity and singularly little justice. And Dublin being the epitome of Ireland, it is not strange to find that Dublin, a city famous for its charitable institutions and its charitable citizens, should also be infamous for the perfectly hellish conditions under which its people are housed and under which its men, women, and children labour for a living." So that gives you some idea of what Dublin was like during this time. But the housing conditions were so bad that one evening, the evening of Tuesday, the 2nd of September, 1913, at about 8:45 p.m., 2 houses in Church Street suddenly collapsed, burying all their occupants underneath the rubble. Now, lots of people rushed in to help, and many were rescued, but some were actually killed in the incident. But this drew attention to the really bad housing situation in Dublin. And it allowed for the setting up of a committee of inquiry by the government to study housing in the city. And what they found was, and they reported actually some very disturbing findings in 1914. Of the 400,000 people living in Dublin, 87,305 lived in tenements in the centre of Dublin city. 80% of these families occupied only one room each. Imagine it yourselves. Imagine your whole family, whatever way that family is constructed, literally living in one room. So you ate in that room, you slept in that room, everything happened in that room. And the Committee of Inquiry defined tenement houses as houses intended and originally used for occupation by one family, but which, owing to change of circumstances, have been let out room by room and are now occupied by separate families, one in each room for the most part. So that gives us even a definition of the time as to what tenement housing was. But with this kind of poverty and with these kind of very bad housing conditions, it led to a lot of social problems as well. And there was a lot of health problems in the tenement, and that was largely as a result of the bad housing, very poor sanitation and hygiene, and bad diet. I'll give you an example of the hygiene. A lot of these houses didn't have an in-house bathroom. You had to go outside to an outhouse that was often located in a backyard. Now, these outhouses or bathroom facilities, if you like, were open to anyone that was walking past the building. So 10 families inside used this one, I'm going to use bathroom, but it was hardly a bathroom. The bad diet also led to health problems in the tenements. And one of the most common and dreaded of the killer diseases at the time was tuberculosis, or TB for short. And it was known colloquially at the time as consumption. The medical inspector for Dublin also commented on, the bad diet and the poverty within the diet. And he said, a man called Sir Charles Cameron, and he said, "It is certain that infants perish from want of sufficient food." And then so we know that young babies were dying because of lack of food. About 20% of all who died in the city were children less than a year old, and nearly all occurred amongst the poorest classes. Now, alcohol was another big problem in Dublin at the time. It played a very large role in the lives of many a family. And the reason for this goes back to those unskilled workers. If you recall, I mentioned that they were paid in the pub, which meant that, you had to kind of buy a drink in order to get your wages. And then you got your wages, and one drink often led to two drinks and so on until alcohol became a problem for you. Then the money was spent on the alcohol problem, and the wives and the children at home were left in misery and in hunger. Crime was also widespread in Dublin City at the time, and it was often connected with the alcohol problem. The figures for serious crimes, such as, for example, murder, rape, and larceny, were 100 crimes for every 10,000 people. That was higher than most of the larger cities in Britain at the time. But most important of all, in this period, workers had no rights at all. Factory owners actually believed that as employers, they had the right to dictate the conditions that their workers had to endure. But into this scene is going to come two men that are going to be very influential. And they're going to try and bring about radical change. And one is James Connolly and the other is James Larkin. Now, James Connolly was born into a poor Irish immigrant family from Monaghan in 1868, but he was actually born himself in Edinburgh in Scotland. He was largely a self-educated man, though he had been educated until the age of 10 in the local Catholic primary school. Now, when you go back into 1913, most people were only educated up until primary school level. Very few went on to secondary school, and very few went on to third level education. So this was not unusual for this type of education. But the difference in James Connolly was that he was very much a self-taught man. He read loads, and he read the philosophies of the time, the economics of the time, because he wanted that education. He became very involved in socialist movements in Britain when he lived there, and he also, when he moved to Dublin, became involved in what was known as the Dublin Social Society, which evolved into the Irish Socialist Republican Party. He did emigrate to the United States in 1903, but he returned to Dublin in 1913, and he had an enhanced reputation at this point in time because he'd organised a very successful dockers' strike in Belfast in 1911. And in that strike, he'd succeeded in bringing about better conditions for women workers in the linen mills. So with James Larkin, who we'll meet in a second, he became a very successful trade union organiser and became the right-hand man to James Larkin. Now, James Larkin, too, was born in Britain. He was born in Liverpool, but his parents were from Armagh. He worked as a docker there, developed a keen interest in socialism, and became a member of the Independent Labour Party in Britain. Where he really made his name, however, was in Belfast. He was very much trying to ensure better working conditions for the dockers, mainly in that area. He, when he moves down to work in Dublin, one of his main targets, or one of the areas that he's most interested in, is targeting the alcohol problem. And he wrote about it at the time, and he wrote about the appalling conditions that existed in Dublin. And I'll give you a little quote from him, because he said, "When I came to Dublin, I found that the men on the quays had been paid most of their wages in public houses, and if they did not waste most of their money there, they would not get work the next time. Every stevedore," now a stevedore was a worker that was employed in the loading and unloading of ships. "Every stevedore was getting 10% of the money taken by the publican from the worker, and the man who would not spend his money across the counter was not wanted." So in other words, you got paid in the pub. If you didn't agree to that and you didn't want to do that and you didn't want to buy a drink there, well, then you didn't get work. So you can see how that led into alcohol problems at the time. But he will go on to form a trade union that's going to become hugely important in Ireland, and that is the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, or ITGWU for short. It was founded in 1909 by James Larkin, but he will work very closely with James Connolly, and in 1912, Larkin and Connolly collaborated to form the Irish Labour Party. The ITGWU is really going to be the bone of contention in the lockout of 1913. But it was not, it was one of the first main trade unions in Ireland that was not British based. And also, very importantly, it did not only cater to skilled workers, it also catered to unskilled workers. It was openly socialist in its aim and reflected the belief that the working classes would always be exploited under the capitalist system. So their main belief was that the workers should organize themselves into huge unions and call general strikes, and that would lead to the collapse of the capitalist system. So very much influenced by Karl Marx thinking at the time. But it was very successful. Membership of the ITGWU rose from 4,000 in 1911 to over 10,000 by 1913. Now, this trend did alarm employers. They began to organize a collective response to the challenges posed by Larkin and his ITGWU union. And one of the main voices in this employer anger against James Larkin was a man by the name of William Martin Murphy. William Martin Murphy owned a lot of businesses in Dublin. He was a Catholic businessman and a very successful one. He owned hotels in O'Connell Street. He owned the Irish Independent. He owned the United Tramway Company. So as you can imagine, he was a very affluent businessman as well. Led by him, the business people in Dublin formed their own organisation called the Dublin Employers Association. Murphy himself was very opposed to trade unions, and particularly trade unions that intervened between employers and workers. He also did not like James Larkin. Now, the feeling was mutual. James Larkin did not like William Murphy. But Murphy believed Larkin to be a very dangerous revolutionary. So he calls a meeting of the Dublin employers in July 1913, and about 300 Dublin employers turn up for that. At this meeting, a decision was taken to force workers to sign the following undertaking, the one that I have there on the screen. So employers or workers would have to sign, "I hereby undertake to carry out all instructions given me by or on behalf of my employers, and further, I agree to resign immediately my membership of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And I further undertake that I will not join or in any way support the union." So basically what William Martin Murphy and his colleagues wanted workers to do was not to join a union and to pull out of one if they did. And this is really what's going to lead to the lockout and lead to the anger. It's often, the lockout itself is often seen as a clash between these two very powerful men, William Martin Murphy and James Larkin. The employers then come together, as I said, and they also draft what's known as a letter of dismissal on the 21st of August. And that letter of dismissal stated that, "As the directors of the Tramways Company understand that you are a member of the ITGWU, whose methods are disorganizing the trade and business of the city, they do not further require your service." So in other words, if you were a member of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, you had just got fired. You'd lost your job. And this was a huge direct challenge to that particular union. Larkin was very annoyed with this, as were many of the workers, and he called the first lot of workers out on strike. And those workers belonged to Murphy's Dublin United Tramway Company. The strike was due to start on Tuesday, the 26th of August, 1913. So what happened on that particular day? Well, shortly before 10 a.m., people were going along in their trams, as you might go along in the Lewis today, and all of a sudden the tram came to a halt at 10 o'clock in the morning. The driver got off and walked away and left you sitting on the tram. You were completely unaware that this was going to happen. So like hundreds of people got stranded around the city. So that they stopped the trams in their tracks, and the drivers themselves went on strike. Around about 700 of 1,700 tram workers joined the strike. So very quickly that day, the city begins to fill with tension. And one of the aims that James Larkin had in mind was a process that was going to be known or become known as the sympathetic strike. So workers in other businesses would go out on strike in sympathy with the tramway workers. So what he tried first is that, he targeted the workers that distributed the Irish Independent, encouraging them to refuse to handle it and protest. Then Easons were asked not to sell the newspaper at all. Now, Easons themselves refused to do that, or the workers in Easons said they wouldn't do that. So thereby the dock workers in Kingstown, modern-day Dunleary, refused to handle any Easons goods to or from England. So this is what James Larkin was trying to establish, a sort of workers' solidarity, if you like, and get one business to go into sympathetic strike with the other. Now, this really angered Murphy and the employers of Dublin, and their response was absolutely immediate and utterly drastic. They literally went down and they closed the doors of their businesses and locked out the workers. And that's where this period of Irish history gets its name, the Lockout. A total of about 20,000 workers and 300 employers were involved in the lockout overall. Now, as the day progresses, the people on strike and the people that have been locked out start to protest and have demonstrations and run into clashes with police. That very evening, James Larkin addresses a group of striking tramway workers outside Liberty Hall. Now, Liberty Hall is the headquarters of the ITDWU. And Larkin says, "It is not a strike, it is a lockout of the men who have been tyrannically treated by most unscrupulous scoundrel. Murphy has boasted that he will beat Larkin. If one of our class should fall, then two of the others must fall in for that one. We must demonstrate in O'Connell Street. We are fighting for bread and butter. By the living God, if they want war, they can have it." So you can see how the tensions were beginning to rise in the city. Well, not to be outdone, the very next day in the Dublin newspapers, there was an interview by William Murphy, and he completely condemned James Larkin in it. And he says at the time, "Mr. Larkin's so-called strike today was the feeblest and most contemptible attempt that was ever made. I think I have broken the malign influence of Mr. Larkin and set him on the run. It is now up to the employers to keep him going." So you can see between the conversations, if we want to be mannerly and call them that, between these two men is really what's sparking the lockout and the striking. So that has led some historians to kind of call it a feud between these two. But of course, it ran much deeper than that because there was thousands of workers and their families involved in this. So James Larkin himself called a public meeting to be held in O'Connell Street in full public, if you like, on Sunday, the 31st of August, 1913. Now, by this stage, the police were called in to kind of patrol all of these protests, keep people in order. And they decided that it was too risky, really, for this meeting to go ahead. The authorities decided. So they banned it. But James Larkin organised for the meeting to go ahead anyway. However, the meeting itself descended into chaos. James Larkin spoke from the window or the balcony of a hotel to really quite a good crowd before him. But somebody that was present that day wrote about what happened as he saw it. And that person was a man called Ernie O'Malley. And Ernie O'Malley will later play a prominent role in the War of Independence. But on this particular day, he just happened to be in Dublin City. And his account of the day is as follows. I was in O'Connell Street one evening when Jim Larkin, to keep a promise, appeared on the balcony of the hotel wearing a beard as a disguise. Now, of course, the irony in all of this is that the hotel that he was making the speech from was actually one of William Murphy's hotels. O'Malley went on to say, he spoke amidst cheers, the hoots for employers. Police swept down from many quarters, hemmed in the crowd, and used their heavy batons on anyone who came in their way. I saw women knocked down and kicked. I scurried up a side street. At the other end, the police struck people as they lay injured on the ground, struck them again and again. I could hear the crunch as the heavy sticks struck unprotected skulls. I was in favour of the strikers. And I'm showing you an image there at the bottom of that particular melee that broke out as a result of this band meeting in Dublin. But we learn a lot by reading the accounts of people that were actually at an event. They can tell us and give us first-hand accounts. So it was good that Ernie O'Malley wrote down what he experienced on the day he was in Dublin. But following these events, Dublin was literally plunged into a state of unrest. There was a lot of nervousness and a lot of concern. After the meeting, Jim Larkin was arrested and imprisoned, but the workers continued on with their strikes. And in the struggle that followed over the coming weeks, you're going to see about 20,000 workers caught up in it. But more importantly than that, it's not just the immediate workers that are caught up in it. It's all their wives and children and their dependents. And the figures for that is roughly about 80,000 dependents are caught up in this as well. And they're going to endure really great hardship because with no money coming in, no food on the table, people are literally going to start to starve in Dublin City. And we learn about this as well from some of the literary giants really that were around Ireland at the time. That had been very involved in the cultural revival movement of the late 1800s. And one of them was a man called George Russell, or A.E., and he wrote on the 6th of October 1913, "It remained for the 20th century and the capital city of Ireland to see 400 masters deciding openly upon starving 100,000 people and refusing to consider any solution except that fixed by their pride. The men whose manhood you have broken will loathe you and will always be brooding and scheming to strike a fresh blow. The children will be taught to curse you. The infant being moulded in the womb will have breathed into its starved body the vitality of hate. It is not they, it is you who are blind Samsons pulling down the pillars of the social order." So you can see the anger even amongst the literary people living in the city at the time against the employers that are treating the workers in this manner. But James Larkin is subsequently released from prison and he goes on and continues to hold meetings with the striking workers, but he has to find novel ways of so doing so that he doesn't get caught and imprisoned again. We haven't time to look at it in person together today, but I put a link on the PowerPoints that you should have a look at. And it's a piece of film and it's taken from a really good series that was run many years ago by RTE called Strumpet City. But this shows a piece where James Larkin goes out on the river to try and talk into the people in the docklands in Dublin. Showing you one of the novel ways that he used to try and avoid arrest. So have a look at it later when you get a chance. But what were the other politicians of the time thinking or doing or not, as the case may be? Well, the Irish Parliamentary Party was the main party in power at this moment in time. Now, they were very much fighting for home rule, the creation of a Dublin Parliament. But members of this particular party were mostly middle class and also drew their support from the farming community, largely from the more wealthier and affluent farms in Ireland at the time. Now, they were very hostile to the strike, but what is interesting is they were hostile to both sides, both William Martin Murphy and James Larkin. And we see this in the words of John Dillon, who was a well-known Irish Parliamentary Party MP. And he expressed the party's exasperation with the lockout when he wrote, Murphy is a desperate character. Larkin is as bad. It would be a blessing for Ireland if they exterminated each other. Harsh words indeed, but at least it shows you the anger that some of the political figures were feeling at the time. Another kind of well-known political figure in Dublin at the time as well, or across Ireland, in fact, was Arthur Griffith. Now, Arthur Griffith had founded the original Sinn Féin movement that evolves eventually primarily into Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. But in this particular moment in time, Sinn Féin was more of a movement than a political party, and it was a growing movement at the time. Griffith frequently attacked Larkin, calling him a strike organiser and the representative of English trade unionism in Ireland. But that is not to undermine Griffith or state that he didn't care. He very much did care about the workers and had huge sympathy for him, but he didn't have much time for James Larkin himself. But because of the continued protests and the police attacks on the strikers and the locked out workers at the time, it was decided by James Connolly to form a workers' defence group. And this he did in November 1913. The headquarters for this workers' defence group was going to be Liberty Hall, the same kind of central location as it was for the ITGWU. And this new group was going to be called the Irish Citizen Army. And the whole purpose of the ICA at this point in time was to protect workers in its clashes with the police. The ICA didn't have much weapons, though. During the lockout, it was mainly armed with hurling sticks and bats that they used against the police to try and protect the workers. They did have a bit of training, though, by a man called Jack White, who was a former British Army captain. And he volunteered to train the army, and he also offered £50 towards the cost of shoes to workers so that they could train. And again, that tells us that, you know, poverty was so rife in Dublin at the time that workers didn't even own shoes. So, you know, this gives us a real, you know, in-depth look into what happened. Now, the strike itself, or the lockout, will go on for a number of weeks, creating absolute misery. And there were attempts by politicians and others to end the strikes. There was meetings of the workers themselves around the city, and particularly in Liberty Hall, to try and find a way out of all of this. There was also, I mean, William Martin Murphy himself wanted an end to the strike, but he didn't want an end where he was the loser. But he did issue a statement on behalf of over 400 employers that repeated his opposition to the ITGWU. The employers then came together and drew up a pledge that workers were going to have to sign if they came back to work. And this pledge was going to state that they were not and would not become members of the prescribed union. And of course, the prescribed union was the ITGWU. So if you were a worker, you would have to sign this that states, I hereby undertake to carry out all instructions given to me by or on behalf of my employers, and further, I agree to immediately resign my membership of the ITGWU, and I further undertake that I will not join or in any way support this union. So that was the only way that you were going to get your job back. Now, the workers held out even at this point, but life was getting very grim and starvation was taking over the whole of the lower economic class in Dublin. So much so, and I don't have time to go into detail on this, but you can look it up yourselves, that there was a suggestion and an attempt to take some of the children out of the inner city that were starving to death at this point in time and send them over to British families where they could be fed and cared for. This caused a variety of emotions within the city, some that agreed with it and did send their children off, and others that were vehemently opposed to it. And the Roman Catholic Church was vehemently opposed to the children being sent over to Britain at this point in time. But still in all, again, it shows us the desperation to which people would have to go to or would try to go to keep their children alive. But the British trade unions did help, but not in the way that James Larkin wanted them to. They did hold a congress in Manchester, and 3 delegates from Dublin attended to inform them on what was going on in Dublin City. So the British trade unions, because the situation was getting so desperate in Dublin, because starvation was widespread, particularly in the tenements, they sent over a ship on the 28th of September called the Hare, which arrived in Dublin. And on board that ship was 60,000 family boxes. Each box held enough food for 5 people. Thousands of people lined up at Liberty Hall with vouchers in their hands to try and exchange them for these boxes of food. The food ship did give some relief to the families at this point in time. It did boost the morale a little bit of the striking workers. But the one thing that the British trade unions wouldn't do, which that James Larkin wanted them to do, was they would not go out in sympathetic strike with the Irish workers. They would help, they would provide aid, they would do all of that, but they wouldn't go out on strike as well. This really is what James Larkin says ended the dispute in Dublin, was the lack of support or the failure of the British trade unions to come out in sympathetic strike. It left the Irish trade union powerless at this point in time, he argued. So on the 18th of January 1914, Larkin and other leaders of the ITGWU held a secret meeting. And they decided to advise workers to return to work without signing the employer's document if they could. But, you know, if they had to sign it, they had to sign it. You can see the dismay in Connolly when he wrote in February 1914, "And so we Irish workers must go down into hell, bow our backs to the lash of the slave driver, and eat the dust of defeat and betrayal." So both men, Connolly and Larkin, were very angry at the British trade unions because they didn't come out in support in sympathetic strike. But using the words of James Connolly there, was it a complete defeat and betrayal? Well, the answer to that is yes and no in many conditions or many instances. The outcome of the lockout, well, there were horrific living conditions in Dublin, and the report into the housing conditions was published in 1914. And it did draw huge attention to the conditions in which people were living in, which will eventually lead to better rules and conditions for accommodation in cities. I have there a spirit of self-respect. Well, that's for the workers themselves. Yes, they ended up having to go back to work. Yes, they ended up having to sign documents that they would bow down to the employer and all the rest of it. But they had held out for a long period of time. But more importantly, they had fought back. And that gave them a spirit of self-respect. Whilst they didn't win, they at least tried, was kind of the attitude. But the bitterness between employers and workers, and particularly workers and the police, lingered for a long time afterwards. The other, I say it depends on how you view matters, but the other force that comes out of this period is the Irish Citizen Army itself. And the Irish Citizen Army will go on to become involved in the 1916 Rising, led by James Connolly. And Connolly himself and his ideals and beliefs are also evident in the documents that come out during 1916 and in the period thereafter. He was very much an advocate of Irish republicanism and socialism. And you can see his leanings in the 1916 proclamation as well. So he was very influential. But in the immediate aftermath of the lockout, on June 1914, James Larkin stated that the lockout in 1913 was a deliberate attempt to starve us into submission and met with well-deserved failure. The employers claim a victory, but the employers did not beat back organised labour in the city. And that was true, actually. I mean, labour movements rose after this. Larkin went on to say, I admit we had to retreat to base, but that was owing to the treachery of leaders in affiliated unions and betrayal in our own ranks. But he's really referring to the British trade unions there. Now, William Martin Murphy looked at it differently. He did believe that Larkinism had been decisively defeated. But the Irish Times saw the position slightly differently, and they reported in the immediate aftermath that the very necessary business of smashing Larkin is successfully accomplished, but that is very far from being the same thing as smashing Larkinism. There is no security whatever that the men who are now going about their work brooding over the bitterness of defeat will not endeavour to reorganise their broken forces and, given another leader and another opportunity, strike a further and a more desperate blow at the economic life of Dublin. So what they were really saying is that out of that period are going to become workers that are going to continue fighting for workers' rights. Now, you know, as we all know, it didn't happen in the immediate aftermath of the lockout because the Great War breaks out in 1914 as well. And that is really going to become the focus of everybody's interest during that period. But the other people like that wrote about it, and let's just look at the words of James Connolly as well. Like he said, the battle was a drawn battle. The employers were unable to carry on their business without men and women who remained loyal to their union. The workers were unable to force their employers to a formal recognition of the union and to give preference to organised labour. From the effects of this drawn battle, both sides are still bearing scars. How deep these scars are, none will reveal. So, you know, a lot of people were hurt and deeply affected by the lockout of 1913. It is a stain on Irish history that, you know, workers, particularly those of the lower socioeconomic group, were reduced to such an awful state of affairs. And I'm not going to read all the next comments to you. You can read them yourselves at a later stage. But Patrick Pearse, who was relatively unknown in 1913 and will come to prominence a little later in Irish history, also wrote about the impact and what happened and what Dublin was like in 1913. So between the literary and the newspapers, you can garner a whole pile of evidence from this particular period. But another author that we're all familiar with, William Butler Yeats, wrote a poem called September 1913, and you may have read that yourselves for English classes. But you know, he really is focusing in on the greed of the businessman in that particular poem. And Patrick Kavanagh will also go on to write a poem after James Larkin's death in 1947. So literary works are a great source for information on some of our important historic moments in Ireland, including the lockout. The other thing I've provided for you here, but I won't read it all out to you, is a chronology of the strike and the lockout, just to help you with your studies at a later stage, so you can kind of follow what happens in chronological order. So all that's left for me to say at this moment in time is thank you all very much for your time and for your attention. And I wish you the very best of luck in all your exams and assignments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elaine. Just to let you know, our next and final lecture will be on Monday, the 7th of April at 2 p.m. and we'll turn the focus to religious education, exploring Christianity, origins and contemporary expressions. And this lecture will be delivered by a lecturer in theology, Michael Sherman. It's open to both 5th and 6th year students and teachers, and you can register at the website carlowcollege.ie. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us today, and a special thanks to Elaine for delivering a really insightful lecture today. Thank you very much.
I hope they got something from it, and don't forget to look up Carlow College Arts and Humanities for your third level history if that's your interest. Thank you very much, everyone.